Dr. Gary Habermas, it's great to have you on Capturing Christianity.
Thank you.
So glad that you could be here with us today. So we're actually here in part because the Evangelical Philosophical Society has been so gracious to give us this room, basically, to do these interviews in. So we're very thankful to them, and we really appreciate the work that they do, especially having the opportunity to network and have people here and do these interviews with so many different people all at once. So it's great to be in partnership with them. But in addition, we're also in partnership with Defenders Media, who they provide social media, and not just social media, but media solutions more broadly to apologetic ministries. So we're very happy to be in partnership with them. Well, let's go ahead and get right into the interview here.
Sure.
So you're working on a book currently on the resurrection, and you're slated to have how many pages? Because I posted about this on my Facebook page, and I said, yeah, I'm doing this interview with Dr. Gary Habermas, and he's writing a book that's about to be 5,000 pages long. And
that's about right.
And people thought that was a typo. So let's talk about the actual
500 would be long enough, wouldn't it? Yeah. Yeah, and you know, what's crazy is of my 40-something books, exactly half of them are on the resurrection. So people might think, oh, well, I get it. He's taken those 20-some books on the resurrection, putting them together, removing the duplication, and that's all the pages. But actually, so far, at 4,300 pages, only about 10% of the material is repeat of anything I've done before. So it's mostly new material. Yeah, and
would you say that's
a lot?
That's the thing that sort of separates this book from all your others and any other book on the resurrection, right? Because it's all new material.
Well, yeah, and I'm answering some questions and treating some subjects, as far as I know, are not treated anywhere in print in any book.
Do you have an example of one of those things?
Yeah, here's some examples. Okay. I spent 150 pages on 19th century German liberalism, which is the heyday of naturalistic theories against the resurrection. So I spent 150 pages on what they taught, what theories were favored, which ones were not. Okay, that's the liberals. Okay, now what about when liberals went against other liberals? Because strangely enough, they didn't just say, well, he takes that, I take hallucination. They'll say, well, he's a loser because his theory's wrong. Mine's hallucination, of course, I'm right. And the next guy comes along and says, I'm wrong. So I'd make three moves. Here's the guys and the theories they take. Here's the liberal response, calling these guys losers, everyone but theirs. And then I have a response of major conservative scholars at that time. And these guys taught that conservatives are not like the kind we might think of today. These guys are from Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Harvard, Yale. And they're writing and saying, you're all wrong. Naturalistic theories are wrong. So 150 pages on the birth of naturalistic theories and how critics go after each one. Now, that's different than me taking the individual theories and giving critiques of each one. I'm not doing hallucinations per se. I'm just doing kind of a history of those theories for those years. That's one example. Got 150 pages on David Hume and the argument against miracles, 80 pages of defense of the crucifixion alone. How do we know Jesus died? Why do almost no scholars, specialists, dispute the crucifixion? You know, why does John Donne of the Cross and Marcus Borg say it's basically the strongest, most readily defensible fact in the ancient world? What's some of the data? So those are some of the separate things. Oh, here's another one. Some people who give evidences for the empty tomb. If you get an article, and I can name them, but the articles, I know one article that gives 8 evidences for the empty tomb, according to critical methodology, or another one gives about 10. I've got 22 evidences for the empty tomb, all critically derived, not like, well, this verse says, all critically derived verses. So there's a lot of surprises. I'll give you one more. I do a minimal facts argument, and I use basically 6 minimal facts. Well, the 2 criteria I use is that I won't use a fact that's not multiply evidenced from a bunch of different sources. And secondly, because of that, the vast majority of scholars in the 90-something percentile allow its historicity. Well, everybody grabs onto this one. Everybody concedes it. And I'm almost never asked, how do you know these facts are true? So I put a list together. And if you count all the individual pieces of data that accredit these 6, it's over 100. Over 100, here's the key, critically ascertained facts that the critics would agree to. That's why the critics don't disallow the facts. We're playing their game. So those are some of the surprises in the book and some of the things I'm looking forward to their coming out.
So about 6 years ago, I learned that my brother became an atheist. And that really sent me on this journey, my original journey into apologetics. Now, when he first talked to me about this and he started to raise his objections, I had no idea if there were any evidence for Jesus, even Jesus' existence,
Right.
let alone the resurrection. And I imagine that probably the majority of Christians are in that same position, where they just have no idea that there's this wealth of information and, as you say, data that supports a historically grounded resurrection event in history. So what is like your 5-minute spiel on the evidence in support of the resurrection? These are facts, these are historical facts, and this is what you specialize in. So
Yeah. Do less than 5 minutes. I start with what I call a minimal facts argument. It's a species of reliability, one of the reliability arguments, but where most reliability arguments are top-down arguments. If the book is reliable, it's like an umbrella. Everything under it gets kept, from the rain. If the book is generally true, whatever's reported under it is accurate. Mine's a bottom up, and instead of an umbrella, I would suggest an example of a brick wall with individual facts being bricks that we put together to build a case from the bottom up. And I've used anywhere from 3 to 7 over the years. Lately, I've been doing 6. And I would say, Jesus died by crucifixion. His disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Because of their belief that he was raised, it is the event that has turned the world upside down religiously. In fact, a recent book on non-believing Jews and the resurrection, they even acknowledge, not being Christians, that Christianity is a resurrection religion. It was the resurrection that powered the religion, powered the teachings, even to the point of being willing to die. And we do have first century sources for arguably the 3 largest names in Christianity. 4, very important, it was proclaimed very early. And today, critics, the consensus position is that you can track the resurrection preaching back to immediately after the cross. In fact, the way it's often stated by, say, Bart Ehrman, is that when Paul said yes to Jesus on the way to Damascus, there was already a body of data called the early creeds that are later written in the New Testament, but they were already being noised abroad. When Paul said yes, there were these heavy creeds, about 80% of which are in the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, because that's a major message. They were already in existence. So when Paul didn't invent Christianity, the main reason, when he came to Christ, the message he hated most, we already have data from that 2-year period before Paul. And then the last 2 would be individuals, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, both of whom become Christians because they believed they had experiences which were appearances of the risen Jesus. Those are the 6 I would use. And to my knowledge, I've had dialogues with atheists, agnostics, scholars, specialists, and they don't dispute any of those.
So how do they respond to this? That you have these facts and you establish them historically, and you say the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead, right? And there are these existing naturalistic attempts of explaining away these facts.
Yeah.
What is the best one to your knowledge, and then why do you think that it fails?
Someone just asked me that yesterday, and I made the point. You'd expect me to say this, but years ago, I would have told you the one that I thought was the hardest answer. Today, I would say, not only are there no good ones, there are no good theories that you can really take and ride to the bank, so to speak. If you're a naturalist, you can really take care of the resurrection with this. But the critics have generally given up espousing these theories. I did an article some years ago where I argued that less than 25% of the critics in the last 25 years, about less than 25% use the naturalistic theories anymore. They will usually say something like this. Yeah, facts are good. I don't agree. It's your idea is the only way to go. But, you've got an evidence case. And if you pushed them a little bit and said, well, what keeps you from believing this stuff yourself? If the
Can I
evidence
guess?
is so good. Go ahead.
Hume.
Well, Hume, but I think generally they'll say, I just don't want to believe.
Really?
And they will say miracles don't happen, and that say that they know you're ready. They don't often want to take you on. Another comment is, yeah, but you got a problem with your theory. What's that? well, you got some data for your theory, and I'm not exactly sure where I would go to refute it. But you're asking me, implicit in your argument, is you're asking me to believe in Middle Earth, Narnia, or if you want a secular example, Oz. You're asking me to believe in that. And there's no world like that. How do you know? Well, there's no, look, everything we know from empirical science, there's not an ultimate universe. And when I'm talking to a person like that, I always go, time out. Let's talk about near-death experiences. And because the evidence has been coming in so well, in a recent book, up to 30 million people in North America, England, and Europe have claimed to have near-death experiences. So I could say, hey, let's just say the number's blown up too much and there's only 20 million. In a way, that's 20 million people who've been to Narnia, if you want to look at it that way. So don't tell me there's no empirical evidence for this. And they'll say, yeah, those are just experiences. You don't have data. Well, you don't say that to me. I just gave a paper yesterday. I know of 300 evidenced NDE accounts where what's reported is empirically verified. So if you can't refute it, and it's almost impossible to refute the NDEs, if you can't refute them and you have this alternate reality, in what category? In the category of afterlife. Oh, so there may be an afterlife. Well, I didn't think so until today, but yeah, I guess maybe there is. Okay, now can we talk about resurrection? See, because I've opened the door to talk about this alternate reality, which may last forever. And you can't say anymore, yeah, but you're asking me to believe in Oz. Because I would say, I sure am, and I've got data for Oz.
So this is probably the most common objection I hear from atheists. And I do a lot of stuff online, Facebook and everything. And the one thing that they say that I see a lot is any naturalistic explanation you can think of is going to be more probable.
That's Barter. I mean, that's a lot of guys.
Is your response?
No, that is this objection, because what they're saying is disciples stole the body is a lousy objection, but it's better than yours because stolen bodies happen in this world, resurrections don't. What he's saying is there's no another world. There's not another world from which Jesus was a strange visitor to this planet. To begin his missionary efforts on earth from his Father's right hand. There's no other world. So when they say, any other theory is more logical, it's not because they're not saying what a lot of Christians think they are. They're not saying all of my theories have better evidence than yours. They're not. They're saying you got some data there, but you asked me to believe in a crazy place and people can rise from the dead, and we don't have any other examples. So chances are you're wrong. And I'd say, all right, 30 million people who claim to have NDEs, 300 of them are evident.
NDE, just to make sure the audience is understanding, NDE means near-death experience.
Correct.
Right, okay.
And if I have 300 cases, and if I start telling you the examples right here, the most incredible ones, people go, oh my gosh, that's really happened? Yeah, it's recorded.
I can already tell people are wondering, well, what, like, give me a taste. Give me one of these.
Give me one or two. But before I do that, let me just tell you one thing. How people are just missing the whole realm. A fellow that just retired from University of Virginia Medical School. He's probably the leading NDE expert. His name is Bruce Grayson. As far as I know, not a Christian.
Okay.
In fact, Bruce told me one time he'd gone to the East from these studies, so maybe Buddhism or something. I don't know. I can't speak for him. But Bruce himself has published 100 peer-reviewed near-death articles in medical and psychological journals. So if people go, you're talking about cartoons, man. It's like SpongeBob, he lives in a pineapple under the sea. Yeah, right. That's why it was written up in 100, that's why 100 articles written up in medical journals. So
yeah,
you're just
that's
not
why
reading the data. Yeah. And so we'd have to go to the evidence cases. Okay, here are a couple examples. Fast ones. Some of them take a while to develop, but a couple fast ones. And
you're writing a book on this, right? So people can go to, no?
I've got a book with chapters in it. And I just debated a guy on this subject. He doesn't believe in them. I do. It was published by Blackwell. And he and I just debated. And I have probably 30 of these cases, evidential cases divided into 5 evidential categories. And,
well, give me these two.
Yeah, here's a couple. This woman has she's being operated on. She has a near-death experience. She's up above her body. She's looking down. She's watching herself. And sometimes they don't even know it's them because they identify with who's up by the ceiling. That's their point of consciousness. And on the top of this medical device that was in the room, hospitals often rivet numbers like offices do to keep track of typewriters and to keep track of things. She looked down and there was a 12-digit number riveted onto the top of this medical thing. And she said, I'm OCD. And so I memorized the 12-digit number. As soon as she comes to, she says to the nurse, write this down. Now, I'm not saying this is a number, but it's like, write this down, 675-21600. 12 numbers. And the nurse wrote it down. And they were later moving the apparatus out of the room. And the nurse jumps in and says, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Let me get my sheet out. Wow, the number's exactly right. Now, she sees that in a state, and many of these people, when you have a cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation, this particular species of cardiac arrest, you have no measurable heart waves, and within an average of 15 seconds, you have no brain waves. So if she was out of her body for as long as 5 minutes, she theoretically has no heart or brain waves. How does she know? How does she know to repeat that data? How does she know what's up there? So that's one well-evidenced one. Boy, people ask me, they'll say, well, I'll say, what kind of evidence do you want? I'll give you. Another one is a real fast one. A guy had surgery. He was up above his body watching the doctors do this, but he got maybe a little bored. I don't know. He started drifting a little bit, looking around. He went through a wall into the next surgical ward, and he watched a guy having his leg amputated. So he gives an explanation of what happens in the room with the leg amputation because I saw it, but you're on that bed. Yeah, but I'm telling you, I saw it. How do you know? Here's some explanation. I'm making up what he might have said, but he could have said, well, all the nurses in the room had white uniforms on, except for this one. She had a pale green uniform on. I mean, something like that. Or these are actual cases. In one, a person dropped a beaker on the floor and it broke, and the person watched it. Or in another one, a woman's pin fell off her dress, and a doctor stepped on it. And the near-death person said, I know who lost the pen, and I can name the doctor who stepped on it because I saw it. So these are data, and many times in the absence of heart and brain, any kind of activity, measurable. And so it seems like we're talking about, here's the point, we're talking about consciousness beyond the initial death of heart and brain. Now, it's near death because the person comes back from it, but during those minutes while they're out, it's highly evidential.
I find this fascinating, first of all. Okay, so can I put this in terms of I'm going to use a technical term here, Bayesian probability, okay? So we're talking later on about what the evidence suggests. That's the second part of the equation. The first part is what the prior probability of the hypothesis is.
Sure.
And it seems like that's what you're trying to raise.
Yeah, now somebody said, when Richard Swinburne does this argument, he puts God's existence. He's written a whole technical great book on God's existence, but he still puts that probability low for those who think it's low, and he still gets, I think, 97% for the resurrection. Well, if you have some things up front, let's just give two: God's existence and an afterlife. Well, how do you know afterlife? Well, I didn't say eternal life. I just said this person was still functioning 3 hours after their NDE, because some of the cases are kind of long. If you start with God and an afterlife, which atheists are often say those are the two planks they have to get rid of to be an atheist, God and an afterlife. If you start with those, you're going to raise the prior probability that the likelihood that a resurrection actually happened.
So I've been wanting to ask a historian this question for a long time now. And it's another common objection that I see is that most probably Jesus' body would have been thrown into a mass grave. So my question is, what is the earliest historical evidence we have of Jews criminals being thrown into a mass grave? Does it come at the time of Nero, around 70 AD, or does it come before then? Because it seems to me like that's the earliest evidence that we have of these mass graves.
Okay, first of all, you're going to be hard put to nail exact historical references when it was done. But I would concede, and many would, that that's what happened to most people, not necessarily mass graves, but a little classier would be a rectangular square in the ground, like today, only without a casket. And you put the body on top of it and covered up. That would be kind of a classy one. A mass grave would be, garbage, in a garbage heap or something. But it's a totally moot point. It's a totally moot point because, like I say to people, let's take your theory. Give me your best shot. What do you want to say? They put it in a garbage dump, and by Sunday, it was already burned up from the smoldering ashes that were always burning.
Or dogs may have eaten it.
Dogs may have eaten it. And I'll just go, that's cool. So what's wrong? Well, I don't know. The gospel story of Joseph is incorrect, or part of it is. He may have been the one that put him in the common grave, but for the most part, the gospel story would be wrong. And I'd say
Joseph of Arimathea.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd say, okay, so what do you have here? You got a moot point. You picked a horrible example because Jesus could have died on Friday, been thrown in a trash heap, had his body eaten and or burned or both. And guess what's going to happen Sunday? What if he appears anyway? What if the parts of that body were transformed? I mean, to give an example, what about a Christian who's fishing, falls into the ocean, gets eaten by a shark? Will he have nothing to be raised at the last day? Oh, no, God can give him a new body. Okay, well, it's irrelevant whether Jesus was in the tomb, whether they took the body and put it in somebody's living room, whether it was in a trash heap. If Jesus is going to rise, he can rise in your living room. What if all the disciples come running to your house because he's there and you have tea time, with Jesus? A little different story, but in your home. So it doesn't do anything to the resurrection message.
Okay. I'm thinking about a Star Trek example of when they beam someone up, right? Or they beam someone from the ship to a planet, and all of the molecules or whatever are reorganized back on the planet. So you're saying that something like that could, possibly happen?
Well, there's a lot of stories as to what Jesus' body was made of. I think the Orthodox view is that it was his body, but changed. And of course, the evidence of the wounds, most probably in the wrists, and elsewhere, the wounds may be still in the head from crown of thorns or lashing. It's still there, so it's his body, but it's changed. And changed how? How much? Well, there's all kinds of arguments about that. But the Jewish view, the predominant Jewish view of that time, is that the body is what's raised. The body is changed.
Physical body.
Yeah, let me give you an example. If somebody has a mole right here, will they have a mole right here on the resurrection body? Go, that's silly. It's like it's irrelevant. I just want to know that I'm there and I would like my body back. According to biology, the body you have in 20 years is not the body you have now anyway.
Maybe this is a perfect time to talk a little about the Shroud of Turin. Are you convinced that that's authentic?
I'm fairly convinced. I would say mid to low probability. I just told somebody over lunch today that I would put probability for the Shroud at 60 to 80, 85%, depending on what kind of mood I'm in.
Okay.
And I'm just saying that to accent the fact that we all have interpretations of data.
So a brief overview of what the Shroud is. And
it's a linen cloth, 3-to-1 weave, a little over 14 feet long, a little over 3 feet wide. And it buries a body. If the body's inside, like a pen right here, the cloth is a 14-foot cloth that wraps around the head and it loops because it's not exactly on the top of the head. So it loops a little bit and open ends are at the feet. But the most interesting thing about the shroud is there's real blood on it. There's a body image. There are hundreds of burial garments in existence. None have body images like this. There's a body image on it. And according to a recent scientific, let's say, conference in Washington, state of Washington, every scientist, over a dozen, who responded to the comment of what is the image on the shroud made of, they all, I understand, all came to the conclusion that the image on the shroud is because of radiation from the dead crucified body underneath. So the man is crucified, has virtually all the marks associated with death by crucifixion of Jesus in the New Testament, but there's a cloth with an image on it, and the radiation appears to have come out from the body onto the cloth and it only affected the surface fibers. Virtually nothing we know only affects surface. Like you couldn't have burned the image in there. Well, picture a thread having 200 fibrils. That's how small the fibrils are in a single thread. The image area is like on 1 or 2 fibrils deep on top of a thread. So whatever made the mark is very, very shallow. So it's not paint, dye, powder, foreign substance on the shroud. There's no foreign
powder, I guess, would have gone deeper into the...
Even powder would, but there's no substance that you can put on. Let's put it this way. You can't fake the shroud today. A guy said to me...
Even today with all of our technology.
That's right. A fellow said to me, just talking to him just the other day, he's a PhD physicist who deals with dating. And he said, and don't give me the argument, he's a Christian, but he said, don't give me the argument that we can't explain the shroud because that's just nothing. There's a lot of things we can't explain. He said, we can't explain the pyramids. And I said, yeah, but there's a little bit of a difference here. You can make a pyramid today. You cannot make the Shroud of Turin.
So let's go to two last questions before we have to end this out. 2 questions on mythicism. Okay, the first one has to do with 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul's talking about the resurrection. Some mythicists say that Paul was really talking not about a bodily, physical resurrection, but about a spiritual resurrection in heaven somewhere. What's your take on that in 1 Corinthians 15?
A couple of general responses. These would unpack, these 2 would unpack to 6 or 8 if I developed them. But the 2...
Do you have this in your book?
Which one? The big one? It's in almost everything I do in the resurrection.
Oh, okay.
So... 2 big responses. Number 1, there's the most important point. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that Paul said Jesus really appeared as a glorified, disembodied spirit. Let's just say that was Paul's view.
Okay.
The point is, there's still a resurrection. And if the Bible taught a Platonic view, that at death we shed our bodies, we flee off to the heavens, disembodied, and able to live in bliss because throughout eternity we can live together and continue to acquire knowledge. That Platonic kind of view, which dominated the church up until the late Middle Ages. If that was Paul's view, you would still have a glorious resurrection view for both Jesus and us. So my point is, if that's what the New Testament taught, that's what all of us would believe, and nobody would be upset with it. We'd all say, this is a glory. This is a really cool view. So you get nowhere by doing that kind of theory because you still have a resurrection. Second response, for a variety of reasons, it's very clear that Paul believed in the resurrection of the body, that he's not teaching resurrection of the spirit in 1 Corinthians 15. He's teaching, for example, whenever Paul talks about the resurrection of the dead, it's always in the plural because Jewish eschatology is that the righteous dead would be raised together. Well, it doesn't quite work with corporate. It doesn't quite work with a bunch of spirits to be raised together. It's more of a bodily event to be raised together. Paul says, Philippians 3, God will change our vile soma, body, to be like unto his glorious soma. He could very easily, by changing one simple word, say, he's going to change our vile soma to be like unto his glorious pneuma, spirit. Doesn't. He says body. So those are just a couple of reasons. Over and over, Paul's anthropology is a bodily anthropology. So I think the Orthodox view of Jesus being raised in a body, even on Paul, it's certainly clear in the Gospels, but even Paul held to bodily resurrection. But we're not getting anywhere. It's like the body in the grave thing. It sounds funny, and they think they're going to get to first base by trying to trap you on something, but it doesn't disprove resurrection. So why are you wasting your time?
So what is, in your mind, the fastest way to disarm a mythicist? Someone who thinks that there is no historical figure that was Jesus living back 2,000 years ago.
Because I would use, I've got a book called Historical Jesus where I list 12.5 texts, many of them outside the New Testament, in the ancient world for the existence of Jesus. But one probably better example I would use, some say, yeah, but you're a Christian. Okay, Bart Ehrman, an atheist New Testament scholar. Bart Ehrman gives 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus within 100 years. Now, 100 years is actually kind of strict, but it's a nice, narrow parameter for saying Jesus lived. 100, and here's an atheist, 100 years time, 15 different sources evidencing Jesus' death. If he died, he had to have lived. So Bart Ehrman calls that one of the 2 best evidences we have for that Jesus lived in history. The other one is that Paul is the best New Testament reference we have. Critics talk about half of Paul's epistles, 7 out of 13, being accredited, and you can use them in arguing because they're great sources. Well, the best thing Paul gives us is that he was an eyewitness to the eyewitnesses. Paul in Galatians 1 and again in Galatians 2, he went to Jerusalem and got to know Peter, James, the brother of Jesus. Then in Galatians 2, John, they're all together. And the topic they're discussing, as Paul tells us, is the nature of the gospel, to make sure they're all on the same page. And Paul concludes, yes, they're all on the same page. But here, that's two great sets of data for the existence of Jesus. 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus, and Paul knowing himself, of course, Peter, James, and John, the big four. He knows all of them, and he can ask them whatever questions he wants to about what Jesus looked like when he was walking and talking in Galilee. So it would be like asking George Washington or asking Thomas Jefferson, what was George like? Asking Adams and John Quincy Adams and Monroe and so on. What do you know about George? And then it'd be really cool if you could talk to Martha. And that's neat because we have the women's testimony for going to the tomb and so on. So you make a multifaceted case for George Washington being the first president of the United States. We can do the same thing with Jesus actually having existed. And as Bart Ehrman says, he knows of nobody, no accredited specialist in the field of religion, no matter how liberal or how atheist or whatever, none of them who will have university, college, or seminary positions, none of them teach that Jesus never lived. The guys who teach it and claim to be scholars are people who don't have accredited degrees. He said with two exceptions, is Bart's count. The rest do not have accredited degrees, and none of them have university positions.
Why are they making such a big splash, do you think?
Probably because they infiltrate almost every website there is and have a bunch of, they have a loud presence. Whatever side you're on, recently there was a choice for a Supreme Court justice in this country. How come the voices that made it on the news shows were the little chattering voices that ran next to the senators and got up in their ear and chirped at them and wouldn't let them sit down at the tables, and because that kind of thing makes the news. And people say, whoa. And when they say, oh, no, and they pretend like they're scholars, but they don't have any training, they haven't been in the field, and all the other scholars, atheists even, like Bart Ehrman, say they're wrong. So to me, that's the real test. It's not just Christians saying they're wrong. It's non-Christian scholars saying they don't have a chance.
So Gary, what in your mind is the value in apologetics ministries like Capturing Christianity? Are they important? Do you think that we need more of them? What's your view?
Well, I think there's probably, I'd have to say they're very important. I would have to say the more informed they are, the more factual they are, the more they are. We don't want Christians who are chirping like the chirpers on the other side who are not scholars, whoever. But the better they know their field and the better they know what they're doing, I think apologetic groups do a tremendous pre-evangelistic kind of work where sometimes you have to sow the seed out in the field before it sprouts up, and to use Paul's phrase, and when it sprouts is not exactly the same form as when it was put in the ground. I think we have to critique other views, sometimes slowly, and you build layers on the data, and you work at it like that. And sometimes it takes people, as you know, years to finally think it's the true message. But I think there's a value, even if people never come to Christ from those sorts of exercises. I think it's very important to strengthen Christians who have doubts, to strengthen Christians who want to be bold in their witness. So I think apologetic organizations, the better ones, the better they are, the better it is. And they pave a path in our culture that is really, really important because of how quickly our culture is moving away from the Christian preaching.
Do you have any tips for aspiring Christian apologists?
I'd say know your field very, very well. Do a lot of reading. Be able to interact with both sides. And that means know what the other side's saying too, and know what the Christians are saying. Be ready with a quick answer. Not to be afraid to speak up, and to always try to draw or to make a bridge between the message and what it should make in people's lives. For example, when someone dies, Paul says, we grieve. You think about Jesus weeping at Lazarus' grave. Paul says, we grieve, but not as those without hope. So a hopeful grieving is a lot different than a grieving without hope. So those are times to come alongside people. So we have to be opportunistic and look for opportunities to share and counsel and always be humble and use all the characteristics we use for people that we usually say would be he's a good guy, whether he's an atheist or not an atheist. We say, he's that's a super person there. So I think to be knowledgeable, to be willing to talk, to willing to engage and break down barriers, I think is incredibly important.
Well, thank you so much, Gary, for coming on to Capturing Christianity. This has been such a fun interview. I wish we had more time, but it's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Enjoyed it.